This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings, or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
Numbers 33. Numbers 33. Numbers 33. It's a long chapter. I'm going to start reading it and then I'm going to pause out. And you'll see why. I cover some of it in the handout. Thank you. Numbers 33, we'll start with verse 1. These are the journeyings of the children of Israel, which went forth out of the land of Egypt with their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. And Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys by the commandment of the Lord. And these are their journeyings according to their goings out. And they departed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the morrow, after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with an high hand in the sight of the Egyptians. For the Egyptians buried all their firstborn, which the Lord had smitten among them upon their gods. Also the Lord executed judgments. And the children of Israel removed from Ramses and pitched in Succoth. And they departed from Succoth and pitched in Etham, which is in the edge of the wilderness. And they removed from, okay, you get the feel for the rest of the chapter. Okay, a lot of it is they went from this place to this place to this place to this place. That is really how the chapter flows. And from that point, I'll jump into the handout and I'll read the passages as we get through the handout here. So, to bring you back into the book of Numbers, because it's been a month or so since we've been in the book of Numbers. We're at the tail end of the book of Numbers. Really, the stories of Numbers are pretty well done, and we're at this section where they're preparing to enter into the land. In chapter 26, they took another census. We had some instructions with the daughters of Zelophehad in 27. Joshua is appointed. Things are kind of closing up in this book. He's appointed as his next leader. We have a whole chapter, 2 chapters on the offerings and the calendar and some of the sacrifices. We have a chapter dealing with vows and a few chapters of vows and then their vengeance over the Amalekites and then the victory that God gives them. Last time we were in Numbers, we talked about Reuben and Gad, how they chose not to take part of the inheritance of the land. I wonder if there's something to that slightly, where they're separating, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Again, don't push these too far. Just let them sit in the crock pot and stew a little bit. And now we're into chapter 33, where there's a review or a summary of their journey. And so that's what I want to cover here. I did find this helpful. This came on top of page 2. This kind of closing out to the book was in, I think it was Gordon Wenham's commentary. In chapter 33, we have God's account of the victories over the enemies as far as their travels. 34, we'll get the promise God's going to give his people a land and they develop it, or how they're going to divide it up. 35 will be God will give his people his dwelling, or he will make the land holy by dwelling in the land with the Levites, having God himself as their possession. And then in the last chapter, 36, Israel will hold the land forever, or they will be God's people forever. So this begins with what we read here in verse 2 of chapter 32. Moses writes this down. They're journeying by the command of the Lord. I put a picture there of a scrapbook. I don't think it came out very well, but I really like what one commentator put. He's like, this is kind of like God's scrapbook of the journeys. And we have read through the journeys from Exodus all the way through Numbers. We've read through the story. We've read through these journeys. All of this has happened. We've read through the ups and the downs. And in one sense, this chapter is kind of like a scrapbook. Now, I don't do scrapbooking. My wife has done a little. She's not huge into scrapbooking. But it's kind of like its own form of art, right? You add little things or whatever to remember a trip. And when you go on a trip and you take pictures, there's things that are very important to you. And when you show them to other people, do they always have that same sense of enthusiasm? No. Okay? You pull up a random scrapbook from a random family that you don't know and you start going through pictures. You might find it interesting, but you're not going to be as connected. You're not going to be as involved. You're not going to be flipping over every picture to see if there's a name and a date on the back because it's not personal. This is a travelogue of Israel, and it's personal to both God and his people. And I want to stop and jump to the New Testament here. Paul makes use of this record. He touches points of it, several points within Corinthians. I pulled one here. In 1 Corinthians 10, we read, "But with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000. Neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed of serpents." We covered that story in Numbers. "Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer. Now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore let him that thinketh he stand take heed, lest he fall." What's Paul's purpose or point? Why is it important for us to remember these stories? So we don't repeat them. They're examples of what we should not do. Now again, tying back to this is kind of a scrapbook. What we have here in chapters 33 is a little bit of a selected history. We're not getting every rebellion story. We're not giving, it seems to be more positive than negative. We are set up here with what seems to be a pattern. The pattern comes way back from Numbers 9, where at the commandment of the Lord they would move camp. At the commandment of the Lord they would make camp. And here it's by the commandment of the Lord that what's going to happen. These are recorded. This is recorded, and then throughout this, there's this, these are the journeyings by the command of the Lord. Like they're moving to these places as God directs and commands. Before we dig into it, the style of how this is written, I may have thrown you all off with the scrapbook idea, but it's very much written like a military conquest. Now, that is one of those things, the first time I read this chapter, I did not think military conquest. I didn't, but in reading the literature, they're pointing to, especially it ties into how Assyrians would record, okay, this is where our military went, this is where they camped, this is the water and provisions. They don't always put in the distances. They usually give the name. They might give how long they were there. They might not. And so there's been a correlation how Israel came out of where? What's that? Bondage in Egypt, right? And this is the travelogue of where they've been, right? So there might be a sense, in a certain sense, this is a bit of a victory march. Now, we've read the whole story of Numbers. Does it seem like a victory march? Probably not, because they have rebelled against the God of Israel. They have doubted him on multiple times. But has God been victorious with his people? Always. Has God provided for his people? Always. In spite of them not necessarily deserving. Another note on this chapter, in some ways it's kind of like the obituary for Moses. Who's the one who's been leading through all this event? It's been Moses. Now, obviously Moses under God, but Moses has been the mouthpiece. And in some ways, kind of like when we read an obituary at a funeral, this is some ways an account of what his accomplishments were, to some regard, with the people of Israel in moving them from Egypt to the cusp of the promised land. And the one thing that has stayed consistent, and Gordon Wenham puts it this way: if God has helped Israel thus far, he will surely enable them to reach their goal, the land of Canaan. This is written as an encouragement to God's people. Now, we've read the book of Numbers. We've been through it. We've kind of been digging deep. We know that God's people failed at multiple points. But that's exactly where we find hope. Because who never failed in Numbers? God never failed once. And in people who failed time after time again, how did God respond? Like a good parent. That's a good way to... He was faithful to his people when they were not faithful to him. And we've been through some of those points where he's like, okay, Moses, stand aside. I'm going to kill everybody off and restart with you. And we've talked about how, well, was he seeing how Moses would respond and act? And the heart of God truly was hurt with their rebellion. I have included on page 4 here a picture of possibly their travels. So basically what's recorded in in chapter 33 is a list of 42 stations, 42 spots where they set up camp and they traveled. And the problem with Bible geography is some of these places we have no clue where they are. And that's why archaeologists dig and debate and argue, but we seriously don't know where some of these places are. There's 2 routes listed on that map. The one route is kind of the small dotted line and the other one's a thicker line. The route taken really depends on where you think Mount Sinai is. Whether it's the one down at the tip where it says Jabal Musa, that is the traditional proposed view of where Sinai is. The other is Jabal Ben Bishr. When someone tells they know exactly where Sinai is, you can probably write them off. There's a lot of debate and discussion on this, and I think one of the reasons God has left Sinai obscure is just like with the bronze serpent. What do you think people would do if they knew where the exact mountain was? They'd probably set up a shrine and start worshiping something there. So anyway, these travels, they can be divided up nicely into 6 cycles, each cycle having 7 locations. And patristic commentators, so these would be men like Origen and Ambrose and Jerome, very early, but not church fathers, they noticed the correlation between there's 42 places, as well as in the genealogy of Matthew, how many people are listed in the line of Christ. 42. So it's kind of an interesting correlation. Gordon Wenham in his commentary notes, I've quoted or alluded to him a lot so far, so sorry about that. There might be some connections between the different cycles. And he cites one, like for instance, where they're at Ramses, that's the miracle of the firstborn. And then in the 8th one, in the wilderness of Sin, that's where God performed another miracle with the manna and quails. He doesn't have a connection for some of them, but then like for the 4th one, the victory over the Egyptians, and the 11th, victory over the Amalekites. So again, let me take a step back. We didn't live through this. And so there's things that the Israelites, when they read this, they're probably connecting dots. For us, it's kind of hard because it's not our family album. Does that make sense? We weren't there. We didn't see it. The next several pages of the handout, I have listed here these different locations where they're mentioned, and then a few notes. And I know it's cram full of information, and I'm throwing the information in, and I'm jumping through it quickly. One thing I want to note is the mention of when they left Egypt. It says they left with a high hand. They left triumphantly. They left by the hand of God. He did something, and who saw it? Everyone. Okay? And in one sense, in Numbers 33, verses 3 to 4, it makes note that it was done in the sight of the Egyptians. But how do we know that everybody heard about this? And I say everybody loosely. I mean, not like every single person in the whole world heard this story. I get that. Yes, this story had spread into the land of Canaan so much that Rahab was saying, hey, we've heard of you guys, and we're in fear and trembling because of this. So the story later. Yeah. So what happened in Egypt showed who God was and his relationship to his people. And so all Egypt, they knew about the event. I mean, they had just undergone the plagues and all of that. The gods of Egypt had been shown to be ineffective. And we connected the plagues of Egypt to how certain plagues seem to correlate exactly to certain gods of Egypt and how God was triumphant over every single one of those. And then this trip has been called by some a victory march. So it's that they come out of Egypt, they're, in a sense, parading to where they will be, and there's an announcement of God did all this for us. Do you think you want to stay in the promised land if these people with their God are on their way? So, the second cycle, page 8 here, has 7 more locations. We have different things cited there. And I put a map on page 9 to go with that. So this is, in a sense, leading... Oh, I'm sorry. The map actually goes with the next page where it fit in. So they're moving forward. God is providing continually through this. Let's see if there's anything I want to make sure I highlight or hit. I don't think so. This gets them to the point of Kadesh Barnea. And it's at Kadesh Barnea, what happens there? Everybody remember what happens at Kadesh Barnea? They rebel. And specifically, what was the rebellion? Not cross the river. They sent the spies. And the spies come back and say, nope, great land, we can't take it, let's go back to Egypt. And so they rebel and they choose not to go into the land, and thus they're forced to wander for 40 years. Page 10 has more locations of where they were, some notes on that. And again, I told you this was a thick handout that I think we're going to fly through, all right? And to give credit where credit's due, most of this is laid out in Dennis Cole's commentary, and I've just reformatted it for our purposes and modified a few things. Page 11, more of what's going through. We also have in chapter 33, verses 37 to 41, notes that at Mount Hor, that's where Aaron dies. He's 123 years old, and this is 40 years after the Exodus. Now, some of the locations here, I should mention, they're not the same names as previously in the book of Numbers. Some of these locations are not even mentioned in the rest of the story. And there's a few locations in previous book of Numbers that don't get mentioned here. Why and how, I don't have a good answer to. This is where nerdy scholars debate and discuss some of this. I'm still going to lean heavily on this is written in such a way that God's people, when they read this, especially the people who had just gone through this, their minds are connecting to what happened. And whether some of these places have undergone name changes or whatnot, the purpose of the book of Numbers is not to just give us history, but it's to give us a theological emphasis and message. And so the point and the message is that Throughout this book, God has been faithful to his people. And they weren't always faithful to him. And there is consequences for rejecting God, but God doesn't give up on his plan and purposes. And there's probably other themes to there. I probably summarized that too broadly. Page 12, we have the sixth cycle and the different locations that they are at and moving forward. And it leads them right up to the plain of Moab. They're on the cusp of the promised land. They're almost there. And this is where the last part of Numbers 33 gets interesting, and I want to pause and read that. So look with me, if you would, at verse 50. Elizabeth, you want to run out? I think Dee is waiting outside. Numbers 33, we'll read from verse 50 to 56. And the Lord spake unto Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan, near Jericho, saying, okay, so here we have a setting and where they're at. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye are passed over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then shall ye drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their pictures, and destroy all their molten images, and quite pluck down their high places. And ye shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land, and dwell therein. For I have given you the land to possess it. Interesting note here. The word dispossess and the word possess are literally the same word. It's like the word to dwell, and it's kind of interesting how it gets used. Verse 54. And ye shall divide the land by lot for an inheritance among your families. And to the more ye shall give the more inheritance, and to the fewer ye shall give the less inheritance. Every man's inheritance shall be in the place where his lot falleth. According to the tribe of your fathers ye shall inherit. But if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, then it shall come to pass that those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes, and thorns in your side, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell. Moreover, it shall come to pass that I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them. So, in kind of commenting on this section here at the end of this travelogue, God has given them the victory time and time again. Now, numbers in the Bible. The number 7 is a repeated number. Kind of the number, in a sense, often of completion. How many cycles have been given so far? 6. So cycle 7 is kind of this anticipation. It's coming. When they enter the land, when God gives them the land, this is going to be another phase of God working on his people's behalf. And so they note that, middle of page 13 there, for the completion of this victory march, cycle 7 lay ahead for the Israelites, as the challenge of verses 50 to 56 implies. I wanted to throw a New Testament reference in here, although this is specifically dealing with our salvation. In Romans 8 we read, what shall we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? Here's Israel marching to the promised land. Again, they rebelled, but God was faithful to his people. God enabled and equipped his people. If God be for us, who can be against us? There should be a sense of encouragement that if they're going to go into the land of Canaan and they have God on their side and they walk with him and they obey him and they listen to him and they follow his directives and orders, based off how God has treated them thus far, how do you think God will treat them in the land? Do you see how this should be a source of encouragement for his people? Verse 50-51 noted here that God speaks to Moses again, and this is right on they're ready to cross over into the land. I've included on page 14 here this little section of verses from verse 50 to verse 56 forms a bit of a chiasm, and that's where you have A and then B, and then you come back to A. So it talks in verses 52 to 53 of the possession of the promised land. And under that, they're supposed to kick out the inhabitants that are there. They're to just get them out, the carved images out, the molten images out, and then destroy the high places. Then they, after getting the enemy out, they are to dwell in the land, verse 53, and this is the land promised, and this is the land they've been given. After that, the second box in the middle there with the B, they are to divide up the land among the tribes, and every tribe gets enough land for them. It's by how big they are. And so there's this emphasis of this is the land they're going to possess. This is God's place for his people. And then it closes out in verses 55 and 56 with a warning of what happens if you don't do what you're supposed to. What happens if you don't dispossess or kick out the inhabitants? What happens if you let them linger around? And it describes them as being thorns and splinters. They're going to trouble you. And ultimately, God's people will experience the curses that were supposed to be on God's enemies. Now, we've been preaching through the book of Judges. We're seeing some of that happen to some degree. I've included kind of a devotional commentary at the end, but I'm out of time. I do want to make mention here a couple things for us as we think about this and move forward. Our story in our lives, in some ways, is like the book of Numbers. We've had our ups. We've had our downs. God's remained faithful. On the days that we are following the Lord, He's faithful. On the days that we're not following Him, He's faithful. And sometimes we receive consequences in life, and sometimes God has to chastise us. But God remains faithful to us. Another thing to note is that looking back, and I know we didn't read the whole chapter for sake of time, this is a list of places they were. And yes, there's a couple mentions of where, like for instance, where things happened. But the overall tone of chapter 33 is victorious, not defeat. Now, if I was preaching just the book of Numbers and it didn't have this chapter, Numbers is a pretty down book from the Israelite side because they failed a lot. But how quick have we seen our own culture change? The time period here in Numbers is about 40 years. 40 years ago, how different was American culture? Do you see how quick things can change? You see how quick perspectives, and so there's a sense where as believers in our history, yes, we sin. Yes, we're still in the process of sanctification, growing into Christ-likeness. Yes, that's still part of life. But when the New Testament talks about believers, overwhelmingly it describes us as saints. It's kind of interesting perspective. And that's because the blood of Jesus Christ washes away our sin. Now, I'm not encouraging you to go sin as much as you can. That's not the point. What I am encouraging you to do is, yes, sometimes we look at our own failures and we just feel like stuck. And we forget that sometimes when God's looking at us, He's looking at us through the lens of Christ, who's taking care of our sin problem. So, comments, questions as we close out? Yes. So actually the term there... So the term there is actually there to... It's the same word for possess, except in Hebrew grammar, when that word is used with a person or a noun as an object, it now changes and it means to dispossess, which is kind of weird. And there's a connection between who they were to drive out and who they were to annihilate. There's some lines of connection there. I'll say this. The Canaanites could have left. In fact, in in Joshua, you have a group of kings who form a confederacy against Israel. But there's another group of people, the Gibeonites. Do you remember what they do? Yes, they pretended that they were from a long ways away because they knew they weren't going to stand up against the God of the Israelites. So they became actors. They came with moldy bread and worn out shoes, and they said, "Oh, we're from a long, long ways away. Make a treaty with us." What's interesting is the Gibeonites, Joshua, they become hewers of wood and drawers of water. And as time goes on, they become hewers of wood and drawers of water for specifically the sanctuary. And they're even mentioned in the exile when they're brought back. The Gibeonites get mentioned. So I don't know that you could say the Gibeonites were worshipers of the Lord when they made that deceptive move. But they certainly feared him. They certainly had we're not going to mess with the same God who just decimated Egypt 40 years ago. So anyway, good thought connection. And that's part of why I left in that on page 14. There's some of the Hebrew still got stuck in the handout because that's coming from that word possess or dispossess, and there's quite a bit of discussion on how that plays, and I didn't fully understand all of it, so I'll tell you that. Let's close in a word of prayer, and we'll start our service in about 7 to 10 minutes. Lord, we thank you for your word here this morning. And Lord, as chapter 33 here of Numbers is a bit of a travelogue and a list of places, it was a list of places you traveled with your people. And just like when we travel and we remember places, you remember the places you were with your people and you remember bringing them along. And you are still seated on the throne. And as our God, you remember where we've been. You've walked through life with us in the past, and you will continue walking with us into the future. Would we remain faithful to you in light of how you have been faithful to us? We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.